It's my pleasure to introduce you to this actor special interest group seminar today. On behalf of myself and my co-chair Lisa Higgins, we're thrilled to welcome Thomasina Donovan to present today. So today's session is a little bit different in topic to what we've seen before, and I think it's really important that that this kind of work digging into costs is being conducted at a high level, and I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Thomasina. But before I do that, I'd like to just acknowledge that we all meet on the lands of traditional owners. For me, that's the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I'd like to acknowledge their leaders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd like to also acknowledge the leaders, past, present, and emerging of the Indigenous people on whose land you meet, you dial in from as well. So, as most of you know, we have this as a regular series of seminars. We have a number of seminars upcoming through the year. At present, the only one confirmed is on the 26th of March. We have Jemima Ride discussing a discrete choice experiment checklist, and I hope you'll be able to attend that as well. But today we have Thomasina Donovan. So Thomasina has over 6 years experience as a health researcher. She's a research fellow finishing off the final stages of her PhD candidature in health economics and implementation science at OSHE at the School of Public Health and Social Work at QUT. Her PhD titled Methods for Collecting and Estimating the Cost of Implementation Strategies in Healthcare Settings combine the knowledge from health economics and implementation science to develop an implementation costing instrument called COST-IS. She's expertise in conducting qualitative interviews, thematic analysis, e-Delphi panels, and systematic reviews, a really broad set of skills, and she's achieved a first-class honours in epigenetics at the University of Canberra. She previously applied her epigenetics expertise in the context of oncology, immunology, and exercise science. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Thomasina. I will hand over to you. We've got about half an hour for the presentation. I believe there should be a Q&A button somewhere, but we haven't located it. Bernie, I don't know if it's just missing. If you have any pressing questions during the talk, feel free to raise your hand. But if it can wait until the end of the presentation, we'll have time for a Q&A after Thomasina's finished. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Thomasina.
Thank you, Richard and Lisa, for inviting me. I'm very excited to share my PhD research. So first I will share my screen so that I can get some slides up, and I'll put these up. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. And as Rich mentioned, today I'll be discussing the COST-IS tool, and COST-IS is an instrument for costing implementation strategies. It was developed in an iterative and transdisciplinary manner for the digital health setting, but it has shown potential to be used within the broader healthcare setting. So today in this talk, I'll briefly introduce myself, explain why there's a need for this instrument. I'll show you the instrument, describe its development, and then work through an example with you, and then finally conclude. So there's definitely time for discussion at the end, which I'm very open to feedback and further questions. Some things that I would be interested in hearing from you guys is what projects this instrument may be useful for, and who in your project would find it most useful, and perhaps what settings it should be piloted next. So that would be great. So first of all, as mentioned, I work as a research fellow at OSHE at Queensland University of Technology, and this work was part of my PhD. But prior to my PhD, I was a researcher working in a lab on novel treatment for breast cancer. And while I really enjoyed this, it became clear to me that progress being made in the lab was still very far from helping those at bedside. And this led me to find the field of implementation science and ultimately my PhD project. So my supervisors, Hannah Carter, a health economist, Bridget Abel, implementation scientist, and Steve McPhail, who has expertise in both disciplines and more, all recognise the need for guidance when costing implementation of healthcare interventions. And this was really the inception of the work, which I'll go into now. So as I mentioned, this instrument costs implementation strategies. Implementation strategies are methods used in the field of implementation science that overcome barriers preventing successful implementation of health interventions. Now, there can be many types of implementation strategies, like these, for example. So we commonly use a terminology framework called ERIC, which helps us navigate the categories. And it does this by categorizing the strategies into overarching clusters, like these, for example. So why do we need implementation strategies or implementation science for that matter? Well, they help us close the gap between what we know from research discoveries and what we do in clinical practice. Without active implementation, it typically takes about 17 years from research discoveries in research to make it to clinical practice. And this is because implementing new practices is often messy and difficult, especially within complex health systems. But implementation activities, they require additional resourcing. And so we need to be able to estimate the costs associated with these resources. Being able to estimate costs is important for a couple of reasons, as you're sure you know. Firstly, it will allow for appropriate funding of implementation activities, which will then increase the likelihood of implementation success and the success of the intervention. And it will also mean that all the costs involved in introducing the best care are available to decision makers for them to use, potentially in policies. So currently, implementation costs are not often included in economic analyses. And one reason is because they could be considered sunk costs as a one-time investment. However, if these one-time investments would need to be made again, perhaps when scaling the intervention to another site, then these costs should really be included. This is particularly important in the setting of digital health because technology can become obsolete in a relatively short time frame compared to traditional health interventions like pharmaceuticals. So the resulting life cycle of digital health innovations often includes more than one implementation phase and actually also a de-implementation phases as well, but that's a whole nother area. So currently, we don't know much about the costs associated with implementation activities because they're rarely reported. A reason why they're not often reported is because the right tools aren't available. There are only a few approaches to costing implementation, but no validated instruments. And we can see this in the implementation outcome repository, which was created after a systematic review gathered all instruments that can measure implementation outcomes, like cost. But it could not find any validated instruments um, that costed implementation. And so we created the implementation costing tool to address this gap. So the tool was really utilizing both the knowledge of health economics and implementation science. And we now know that implementation science helps us close the gap between what we know from research and what we do in clinical practice by finding and overcoming barriers that are preventing successful implementation. And then health economics helps us allocate our limited resources within healthcare to the areas of greatest benefit. And the tool really bridges these fields and facilitates their collaborations. Bridging the fields will generate potential to ensure the healthcare system contains the best care possible. So that's kind of the background. And now I will briefly show you the tool before I go into how it was developed. So CostIS is currently available online via the QR code or the link. And online, it outlines that it's a tool for costing implementation strategies in healthcare, and also that its scope is to collect data on the costs associated with implementation strategies. From this webpage, you can also download the templates, of which there are 3 in the instrument. Also up here is a worked example, which I will go through today, but you can download that to help you use that as well, and a user guide, which was developed after I applied the tool on 3 case studies, and then those completed case study are there as well, that they might provide more examples to help you use it. Also on the web page, I listed some what I find useful resources up there and a contact. So my email is up there if you ever want to reach out. Also, I started monthly drop-in sessions. So the Zoom details for that are up there as well if anyone was interested. So onto the instrument. CostIS is made up of 3 templates. The first one is a planning template, and the purpose of this template is to help identify the specific data items that need to be collected, and this will allow for comprehensive targeted data collection later in the instrument. Template 2 is all where you capture your data. It's used to collect the data necessary to quantify the cost of resources associated with your implementation strategies. And the level of detail to include in here really depends on your project. We found that the listed columns in this template provided sufficient granularity for the subsequent analysis. But the template was designed to be flexible, where you could add or take away columns as needed for your project. Template 3 is about valuation. So this is where you value the identified resources, of which most will be labor resources. And this is separate from template 2, just for clarity and ease of update, particularly between sites, I found. But it pulls, template 2 pulls from template 3 as well. So as I said, CostIS is a data collection tool, and any subsequent analysis from the data collected should really be conducted in a meaningful way to the project as determined by the analyst. So here is an example of how I analyze cross data by implementation strategy, and I organized that into those overarching ERIC clusters. And so for me, this just showed that in most of the case studies, provide interactive assistance as a strategy was very dominating use of resources. I also compared by labor and non-labor, and not surprisingly, labor is the most resource used for implementation strategies. And then you could also see by site or project team and how that was split. But the templates were designed to collect data at varying levels of detail so that it could be used on a wide range of projects. Okay, now into its development. So CostIS was developed over 4 phases. The first one being a systematic review so that we could identify current practice and methodology. And then interviews in phase 2, where I interviewed stakeholders that were likely costing implementation to see what they were currently doing on the ground and what they wanted or needed. Then I made a prototype of the tool and went back to those stakeholders to make sure that their wants and needs were being addressed. And then I did preliminary validation of the tool through a collective case study. So just to quickly go through the findings in brief from the systematic review, the main finding was that there's no established guidance to cost implementation. And this was found from the low quantity of papers that actually reported implementation costs. When implementation costs were reported, it wasn't very clear. So it might just have an overarching amount, or they might detail it in the methods but not actually specify it in the results. It would just be absorbed into aggregate. And additionally, when it was costed, the methods used to cost implementation was very unclear in the literature. So then we went to people who were likely costing implementation, and this was implementation scientists, health economists, and other people in the health system potentially costing implementation, because we identified that perhaps it's not something that you publish, but we know that people are doing this on the ground. And so I conducted semi-structured interviews to understand what they were doing and what they'd like to do. And I'll present 4 main findings of that, which we then turned into recommendations that were then absorbed as a feature into the CostIS instrument. So the first finding was that it was very challenging to identify what is implementation cost data. And so our recommendation for that is to clearly outline a set of discrete cost categories. And one suggestion that CostIS uses is by leveraging that ERIC framework. And so they're clear categories of different strategies that might help identifying where your implementation costs are. The next finding was that there was a big burden for collecting the necessary data. And so recommendation is to reduce burden of data collection. And that can be achieved in CostIS by using already collected data. Later we show in the collective case study, those were conducted using project data that was collected for other purposes in the project, and then used in CostAS to get the implementation implementation cost estimates from that. So that was one way we reduced burden. We found that implementation costing was really facilitated by multidisciplinary collaboration. So the recommendation is to increase collaboration. And the CostAS feature that addresses this one is the fact that it was really developed transdisciplinary by getting both views and understandings from the fields of implementation science and health economics. The last one was that staff time tracking was the most frequent method used, but there was a lot of variation present in how this was conducted. And so we recommend having a standardized approach or tool to this so that later, it could be compared across different projects if we all did this in a similar fashion. But if we're listening to what people want on the ground, they really want practical tools. So although we want this standardized approach, it can't be too laborsome. And so it really needs to be pragmatic and flexible. And that's really how we designed CostIS. So at this point, I created a prototype of what I think the tool would look like and presented it back to another group of implementation scientists and health economists in a modified e-Delphi. So most of these were from the interviews, and then I had additional participants as well, and elicited their feedback in a survey via Qualtrics. And so some of the things I asked was, could this instrument comprehensively collect data on implementation? Is it useful? Is it flexible? And is it practical? And so after the first round of the modified e-Delphi, all of these hit consensus. But in addition to this, we had free text boxes, and the participants provided really, really good feedback that I also went and included into the prototype. One of the areas of feedback was around refining the scope to make it clearer on when and where you would use this type of instrument. And so this is when the instrument aim was changed to costing implementation strategies. Before that, it just said implementation, which can be a bit hard to conceptualize. So we scoped it back to implementation strategies. So then in round 2, I posed a question of, I guess, refining the scope to see if that was appropriate for this tool and in general, and that hit consensus. Some other feedback that we got from round 1 was the fact that users of this tool would need to have assumed knowledge of implementation science to use it, and that would then reduce the users that could use it. So I asked, is it appropriate to assume that our users would have implementation science knowledge? But this did not hit consensus because quite commonly people are implementing who aren't implementation scientists. So that does limit its use. However, I do feel if you're going to cost implementation strategies, you would likely know what an implementation strategy is, but it is a limitation nonetheless. And the other question I posed in round 2 is, up until this point, it had been at a digital health focus. And I asked, could this tool, and because we aligned to the implementation strategies, which are generic in nature, so most projects use similar strategies like training or education or facilitation, we thought, well, perhaps it's now more generic. Could it be used in the beyond the digital health setting? And although this did not hit consensus from the expert panel, there were comments around it's possible, it should just be tested. And so that's what we did in the 4th phase, which was around preliminary validation. And so this phase was a collective case study, and we found that CostIS was a flexible instrument that could be tailored to meet the requirements of a range of implementation projects. And so we found that out because we used 3 different case studies, which were quite varied. They varied in length, so from 1 to 4 years, from 2019 up until 2023. They didn't vary much in location. They were all Queensland projects, but their sites were very different. So one of them had 11 residential aged care homes. one was 3 hospitals, and one was 3 wards within a hospital. One of the case studies had a digital health element in its innovation, whereas the other 2 didn't. And CostAS was able to perform in estimating the implementation costs across all 3, and so we find that there's probable ability for it to be used beyond the digital health setting. Okay, so that was its development and really all of my PhD. And so now I will go into a worked example. So for this worked example, I've taken a paper from the literature, which is looking at implementation costs of a type of digital health innovation, which is computer-assisted clinical decision support systems. So if I was going to cost this, I would probably go to its methods section of the paper, and I can see in this paragraph that they talk about a stakeholder meeting that was likely part of the implementation. So if I wanted to cost this in CostAS, firstly, I would go to template 1 and the planning. And so the activity we put in there, which is the stakeholder meeting. And then for our resources, they're actually all listed here. Oh, sorry, we'll go to strategy first. And I know that that's a advisory board or working group type strategy, but you could really name that anything that was wanted or relevant to the project. So as I was saying, resources. Here, it's all just labour resources, and they're all listed here. So it's your directors of health services, district public health nurses, midwives, and other key stakeholders as they've listed. And you might also want to consider whether you want to cost a meeting room or not for this particular meeting. It really depends on your setting. If you have a place that likely has a lot of meeting rooms that are free, there's probably no additional cost to holding that meeting room. But if it was in a context where you have to hire a hall or a town hall, then that could be something you include as well. So then I would go over to template 2. And first I'd put in my activity, which I probably could shorten to just stakeholder meeting. I'd choose the strategy it relates to. And then I found these fields of date, phase, and site very helpful later when I was doing the analysis. So you could fill these in as well. The purpose was useful when I had several of the same activities, so several stakeholder meetings, and I was trying to remind myself which was which, although the date could also be useful for that. Then each of the unique resources gets their own row, and so they get put in the resource column, and the information we previously have gets copied down into the subsequent rows. Following that, I would go to template 3 to value these resources. And firstly, you could categorize them into whether they're a site team or a project team. In one of the case studies, the project lead found it was very helpful to categorize site versus project team. And so this was something we incorporated later so that they could demonstrate how much time the site was putting towards this project and how much the research or project team was putting towards it. You could put in the annual salary, which will then calculate the hourly rate and hourly with on costs, and you could change that if 25% does not reflect the context. Then for any non-labour resources, I've added them down the bottom of this table just to, as there's different information that you might want to put there. And so if you're costing a meeting room, this is where you put that information. So once template 3 is filled in, you can go back to template 2 and it will pull that hourly rate and resource category from there. Then it's just to fill in number of people involved, their time spent, which will then calculate hours and cost. And then these last 2 columns is second last is labour or non-labour. I found that helpful again in analysis, and so I've added it here. And then data source. I think this was mostly helpful when I was doing it retrospectively, but if you were to capture this information prospectively, it may not be necessary. Okay. So this is an example of how I would maybe analyze this type of implementation cost data by showing the resource on the y-axis by each resource, and then implementation cost at the bottom. And this would just show you your spread of implementation cost by each personnel. And so that's one way of demonstrating it. Okay. Oh yes, that's what I want to touch on. I think out of the whole process of costing implementation by using CostIS, I think this template 1, is probably the most challenging to fill out. The piece around identifying what is implementation and what isn't implementation is really tricky. And I think it's tricky because it's dependent on the project. And so it can sometimes vary, which makes it hard. Okay, pushing on to the conclusion of the talk. The use of CostIS will likely have a few implications. I hope so. Firstly, I hope it increases reporting of implementation costs in the literature. I hope that the reliable implementation cost estimates produced from CostIS will inform appropriate resourcing of implementation strategies, which will then result in a greater likelihood of implementation success. And finally, I hope that the implementation cost estimates produced from CostIS will be included in economic analyses or evaluations to provide decision makers with reliable information about the full extent of costs for particular healthcare innovations. I would now like to highlight limitations that CostIS has at the moment, and it was that most of this work has been taken in a retrospective approach. And it would be really nice to do it prospectively and see how it performs. Additionally, the majority of my participants through the development work were working in academic context and based in Australia, so not sure how much it works outside of this or beyond this context. It should be noted that CostIS does not capture all resources, and of note, it only captures tangible resources of implementation and not intangible resources for implementation. So an example of intangible resources is, for example, someone's time in an organization. So having organizational knowledge is a very valuable resource that implementation scientists highlight, and they would probably be able to leverage that within an implementation project, but that isn't able to be captured here. Future directions for CostIS or costing implementation in general. So for CostIS, it could become part of a broader costing suite so that we can really capture the full extent of costs when introducing new healthcare innovations. I hope that there's some reporting guidelines around how to report implementation cost data in the literature so that it's easier for people to compare between published studies. And economic evaluations on implementation strategies would be really interesting for implementation scientists to know which ones will produce more effectiveness with less resources needed. Yeah, so I think that's all my talk for today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Thomasine. That's I thought really interesting, and I think that implementation side of things is definitely something which is probably a bit underdone in the field, and it's really great that you're working in that space. I think it's something we should be thinking about more, certainly. So it's just after past, so we have a little bit of time for comments and questions from the audience. So if you have a question, we'll see how the tech works. If you could put your hand up, then we'll try and open up the floor to someone asking a question. Does anyone have a question? Does anyone want to be the first brave person to do it?
I have a question to get us started while we see if the tech works. I also think that people can request to unmute, which will let us know who might want to ask a question. That was fantastic. Thanks, Thomasina. Is there a plan to test this out, in other settings outside of Australia? I mean, obviously it would be, helpful to be able to have a common instrument. We're obviously the Health Economics Alongside Trials group, and a lot of the trials we do are, certainly a lot of the trials I work in, a lot of the trials that others work in are often multinational studies. Is there any plans at the moment? Are there postdoc plans?
No current plans for outside Australia, but I am very open to collaborations. I think I kind of, have the tool and I'm willing to have it applied in lots of different settings to see how it works, and if it needs tweaking because it's been put into different contexts, I'm really happy to see that develop as it goes more. But yes, no plans at the moment other than very open to more plans.
Okay. So Mitch has put his hand up. Let's see if we can get, can you try and speak, Mitch, and see if we can hear you?
It's not muted, but we can't hear you.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, great. Good to see you again, Richard. It's been a while. That was a really great talk, Thomasina. I was really interested in that. I'm wondering whether any concerns were raised by the people you were co-developing the tool with around non-health economists potentially using this tool and populating data without having a full appreciation of how it's going to be analysed, and then potentially getting to the end of their study and not being able to use the data because they didn't sort of populate it correctly. I mean, is that a worry when you've got people without a health economics background collecting this data?
Yeah, no, that is a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up. I think so far I've only tested it retrospectively, and it's really been me applying the tool to projects who have already collected their data around project data. So if I was to envision this to be used prospectively, I think I'm more seeing that template 1, the planning template, is probably completed ahead of time. That would be ideal. And then template 2, there might be multiples of those being provided to the implementers or people who would know, how much time they're spending towards the different implementation activities. And then I would see a piece of work at the end of bringing all that data together for then the analysis. So I guess, the concerns around probably missing data or not the best data being collected are there, but I would hope that really thoughtful planning at the beginning might be able to mitigate some of those issues. And that planning at the beginning, I would hope would occur between, or at least alongside with, a health economist to guide that. But there's probably, likely limitations there as well.
Great. Thanks, Thomasine. Any other comments or questions?
We know the hand up function works. Marina.
Yep.
Are you able to unmute yourself, Marina, or do we need to do it? Bernie, there we go. Go ahead, Marina.
Can you guys hear me?
We can.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Thomasina, for a wonderful presentation. We've talked before about this tool, and I think I mentioned to you that we've been using this tool for our trials, our implementation trials, and using it prospectively. And it's been quite helpful in terms of giving people structure on the sort of data that they need to capture. But yeah, I think the initial step that you mentioned about planning it carefully, I think it's been quite helpful. And also we are doing like sort of regular catch-ups to check whether the data that we need are being collected, and this has been quite helpful. But I wanted to ask you, at some point at your presentation, you did mention that I think some feedback that you got from stakeholders was that they wanted a way of using all the data that was already being collected for other purpose to be able to feed into the Cost IS tool. And I wonder if you could expand a bit more on that, because quite often we do have lots of process evaluations that are conducted alongside the trials. And I'm just interested to hear a bit more about that, if you could expand on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Marina, and thanks for sharing your experience of using the tool prospectively as well. That's very helpful even to me. So around using already collected data, I think the main purpose of that is trying to reduce the burden of collecting more data, so we're adding to the things that we need to collect. And this is now, well, if we're collecting implementation costs, is that not, a cost itself? We don't want to kind of be running around in a circle costing what we're costing. But so some things that I used as part of already collected data would be something like meeting minutes. So I was able to go through meeting minutes to see who was there and how long did it take. Other things was like field notes that the implementation team were already taking on the site, just as part of their project management, I guess, protocols. So that data was already there. I could see who was emailing who, and I was able to capture that. So unfortunately, it's not like a streamlined feed into the Cost IS, but it's a way of not having to collect new data. I guess it's project data that's already there. Yeah.
Can I ask another question, Thomasina? Obviously, I can see easily how this can be done alongside an implementation trial, but for a lot of us, we're working in trials that aren't implementation trials, but they're trials of interventions that, should it be shown to be effective, that intervention will be implemented, but that implementation may differ in trial site. Like the way you implement an intervention in a trial isn't necessarily exactly the same as how you implement it in real world practice. And do you have thoughts on that with regards to how you would cost it?
Yes. They're coming. No. I think I have a few thoughts on that. Firstly, I think it is still really important to use it in these trials that are more intervention focused, even if it's just to highlight to decision makers, this is the cost, but don't forget about, potentially this. Even if you can't cost it, just highlighting that there's potentially more to show. So that's one thing. And then the next is, I think this is where potentially the resource template could be quite helpful, because I know when I was costing one of the case studies, and I'd have the resource in there, and some of the data collection was done by a PhD student or someone else with a different, oh God, how am I trying to say this? I think the resource template will make scalability a little bit easier because you can adjust the salaries on there quite clearly. And so although it might not capture a range of different activities, at least you could show in different regions what salaries of people that are likely there maybe conducting the implementation in that area. So I think that's one way that it could be used. Yeah. I think there's a few unknowns in that one, unfortunately. Yeah.
Any other questions? Just raise your hand. Or sorry, Richard, were you about to? I think as people go on, use the QR code and go and have a play, I'm sure that people will have more questions. And so your email's there, and I assume your email's available on the link page as well. So
Yeah,
I
very
think,
much
you know,
so.
the more people, I think it's a fantastic initiative, and I think that the more people that can use this, you know, the better it will get. And I think it would be really interesting to use it, as I said, outside of implementation trials, to see how it works in alongside intervention trials that aren't, you know, hybrid effectiveness implementation trials. Will be really interesting to look at. If there's no other questions, just give, please do put up your hand if you have any last minute questions. But Thomasina, we're really grateful for your time today. It's a wonderful initiative, and I can see it, you know, being great for this group, and I think, you know, great for people, you know, getting things implemented in the future in a way that is helpful to not only just policymakers but everyone involved. Thank you to the ACTA team for, as always, organising us and having us all sorted. Just a reminder that the next webinar is on the 26th of March with Jemima Ride from Monash University discussing discrete choice experiment checklist. When you do leave, I believe the technology will open up a survey. Please do complete it. It really helps us with our planning and for future seminars. And we look forward to all seeing you at the next seminar. Anything else, Richard?
No, nothing. Thanks so much, Thomasina. Really, really great work. So yeah, looking forward to see direction it goes in next.
Yeah, and thank you guys for bringing me along. It was really nice to share. Thank you.
Thank you all, and we will see you next month.